The valet at the Oak Ridge Country Club has a way of looking at your car that tells you exactly how much he expects in a tip before you even kill the engine. I pulled the silver sedan into the circular drive at 7:14 p.m., 14 minutes past the time my mother, Audra, considers civilized. I watched the young man's eyes flick from the grill to my shoes as I stepped out. He saw a successful commercial broker in a tailored charcoal suit, but I felt like a man walking into a deposition where I was the only one who hadn't been coached. Before we dive deeper into the story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. The lobby smelled of expensive floor wax and the faint, citrusy tang of gin. It's a scent that has defined the Vancett family milestones for 3 decades. I didn't check my coat. I didn't want to stay long enough to need a claim check. I walked toward the west dining room, my heels clicking on the marble with a rhythmic precision that usually settled my mind before a closing. Tonight, however, it felt like the ticking of a countdown. I found them at a corner table, the one with the best view of the manicured 18th green, now a bruised purple under the twilight. Audra sat at the head, her posture as rigid as a frozen lake. She was wearing pearls that I had paid for 3 birthdays ago, though she had told the jeweler at the time that they were a gift from a secret admirer. My sister Tessa was to her right, already halfway through a martini, her phone glowing in her lap like a radioactive coal. "You're late, Marshall," Audra said, not looking up from her menu. She didn't offer a cheek to kiss. She didn't ask how the 3-hour drive from the city had been. She simply noted the lapse in my performance. "Traffic on the I-95 was a nightmare," I said, pulling out the heavy oak chair. "Good to see you too, Tessa." Tessa glanced up, her eyes glazed with that familiar mix of boredom and entitlement. "You look tired, Marsh. Is the market finally catching up to you? You've got those little bags under your eyes. Very middle management." I sat down and signaled the waiter. "The market is fine, Tessa. I just spent the afternoon finalizing the restructure for the Northwood development. It requires a bit more mental energy than whatever it is you're doing with that lifestyle blog this week." "It's a digital brand consultancy," she snapped, though the fire didn't reach her eyes. She didn't need to win the argument. She just needed to mark her territory. Audra cleared her throat, a soft, dry sound that commanded immediate silence. "We aren't here to discuss Marshall's exhausting career or Tessa's creative ventures. We are here to celebrate 40 years since your father and I took our vows. Even if he isn't here to see it, the legacy remains. My father had been gone for 5 years, but Audra used his memory like a gavel. We spent the next 45 minutes navigating a minefield of polite conversation. I listened to Audra recount the latest grievances regarding the neighborhood association while I picked at a plate of overpriced sea bass. I watched the way they moved. It was a choreographed dance of exclusion. They shared looks, quick, sharp glances that bypassed me entirely. When Tessa laughed at a joke about a neighbor I didn't know, Audra joined in, her eyes crinkling in a way they never did when I spoke. I was the provider, the silent partner in the firm of Vance and Daughters. I paid the property taxes on the colonial house Audra refused to downsize. I covered the temporary gaps in Tessa's business ventures. I was the structural beam in a house that was decorated to look like I didn't exist. "I think I'll have the soufflé for dessert," Tessa announced, signaling the waiter with a flick of her wrist. "And another round of drinks? Marshall is paying after all. He's the big success." "Of course he is," Audra said, her voice dropping into that smooth, manipulative tone she used when she wanted something. "It's the least he can do for his family. Family is everything, isn't it, Marshall?" I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. I saw the calculation behind the polished exterior. "Everything has its price, Mother." "Don't be cynical," she sighed. "It's so middle class." About 20 minutes later, I excused myself to find the restroom. The hallway was quiet, lined with framed photographs of past club presidents, men with heavy jowls and certain futures. As I washed my hands, the door swung open, and I heard voices I recognized before I saw the faces in the mirror. It was Tessa and a woman I recognized as Evan Holt's wife, Sarah. They didn't see me in the alcove near the stalls. "Is he still footing the bill for the whole summer house?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed but eager for the gossip. "Every penny," Tessa laughed, the sound echoing off the tiles. "Hey, he thinks he's earning his way back into the inner circle. Honestly, Mother and I have a bet on how much longer we can keep the family legacy guilt trip going before he realizes he's just a glorified ATM. He's so desperate for a seat at the table, he'll pay for the table, the chairs, and the floor they sit on." "Does he know about the partnership deal Caleb is moving on?" "God, no," Tessa hissed. "If Marshall knew his own sister was the one who gave Caleb the proprietary data for the bid, he'd have a breakdown. He's so technical, so boring. He doesn't understand that business is about who you know, not how many spreadsheets you can build. We're just redistributing the wealth where it's actually appreciated. The door swung shut behind them as they left. I stood there, the water still running, watching my own reflection. I didn't feel angry. Anger is a hot, messy thing that clouds the judgment. Instead, I felt a profound sense of clarity. It was like a complex financial model suddenly clicking into place. All the variables accounted for, the risk assessed, the ROI determined. I wasn't a brother or a son. I was an asset to be liquidated. I walked back into the dining room. The soufflé had arrived, a wobbling tower of sugar and air. Audra was dabbing a napkin at the corner of her mouth. She looked up and gave me a thin, practiced smile. There you are. We were just discussing the holiday plans. We thought Aspen would be lovely this year. You'll need to book the chalet soon. They fill up by next month. I didn't sit down. I stood by the table, my hand resting lightly on the back of my chair. I won't be booking anything, Mother. Tessa frowned, a spoonful of soufflé halfway to her mouth. Why not? You love the skiing there. I have other priorities, I said. My voice was calm, conversational. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my wallet. Audra's expression sharpened. Marshall, don't be difficult. We've already discussed this. It's a family tradition. Traditions change, I said. I signaled the manager, a man named Arthur, who knew me by my first name because of the size of the tips I usually left. He approached with a professional smile that faltered when he saw my face. Is everything all right, Mr. Vance? Everything is fine, Arthur. I'd like to settle my portion of the evening. I'm leaving now. Your portion? Audra's voice rose a fraction of an octave. Marshall, what is this? I looked at the itemized bill Arthur held on his leather-bound tray. I had the sparkling water, the sea base, and one scotch. I believe with tax and a 20% gratuity, that comes to $85. Put it on my card. I handed him the plastic. The table went silent. Tessa dropped her spoon, the silver clattering against the china like a gunshot in the quiet room. You can't be serious, she whispered. The bill is over $600. The wine alone? The wine you and Mother drank, I corrected. The soufflé you ordered while I was in the restroom. The martinis, those are your expenses. I'm sure you have your purse, Tessa. Or perhaps Mother can use some of that secret admirer money. Audra's face turned a mottled shade of pink. You are embarrassing us, Marshall. Think of where you are. Pay the bill, and we will talk about this at home. I am thinking of exactly where I am, I said. I took my card back from Arthur, who looked like he wanted to vanish into the woodwork. And since I'm leaving, I'm also canceling the recurring transfer for the property taxes on the estate. You'll receive the paperwork on Monday. I'm sure you and Tessa can find a way to monetize your digital brand to cover the shortfall. Marshall, Audra hissed, her hand gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Since you're here, you pay. That is the arrangement. The arrangement is over, I said. I leaned down, just far enough so only the two of them could hear me over the low hum of the other diners. I overheard the conversation in the restroom, Tessa. Tell Caleb I said hello, and Mother. The pearls look lovely. They really do. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back to see the panic setting in. I didn't need to see the way they would scramble to find a credit card that wasn't maxed out, or the way they would have to explain to the manager why the successful Vance family couldn't cover a dinner bill. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the valet brought my car around. He held the door open, his hand out. I reached into my pocket, found a $1 bill, and placed it in his palm. Keep the change, I said. I drove away from the club, the lights of the city shimmering in the distance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about what I owed. I was thinking about what I was going to take back. The obligation had been a heavy coat I'd worn for 20 years. I had finally taken it off, and the chill felt better than the warmth ever had. The game had changed, and for the first time, I was the one holding the cards. The silence of my apartment at 3 a.m. was not a void. It was a workspace. I sat at the mahogany desk in my study, the only light coming from the dual monitors that cast a cool, blue glow over my hands. On the left screen, a spreadsheet tracked 14 years of familial support. On the right, the back-end portal of my private banking suite waited for my command. In the world of high-stakes commercial brokerage, we talk a lot about leverage, but people rarely understand that leverage is just another word for a leash. My mother and sister had spent years lengthening that leash, confident I would never notice the collar. I began with the low-hanging fruit. I logged into the utility portals for the Colonial House in Northwood. For 6 years, the electric, water, and gas bills had been on an automated draw from my secondary checking account. It was a silent subsidy, the kind of thing Audra had framed as a temporary bridge after my father passed. which then became a permanent fixture of her lifestyle. I clicked through the settings, my mouse movements precise and devoid of hesitation. I unlinked the accounts. I did the same for the premium landscaping service that kept her hedges trimmed to the exact inch required by the neighborhood association. Then came the country club dues, the very membership they used as a stage to mock me. I submitted the resignation of my secondary corporate sponsorship. There is a specific kind of quiet that follows a financial severance. It is the sound of a safety net being unhooked while the acrobat is still midair, blissfully unaware of the gravity waiting below. I felt no guilt. Guilt is for those who act out of passion. I was acting out of an audit. My mind drifted back to a summer 10 years ago, a memory I had suppressed under the weight of perceived duty. I had been working 80-hour weeks to close my first major deal, and I had asked Tessa to help me organize some of the filing for the closing. She had agreed, then billed me for her consulting time at a rate higher than my senior analysts. When I questioned it, Audra had told me that family should always be compensated for their labor, yet I was expected to provide mine for free as a matter of honor. I closed the utility tabs and opened my proprietary work server. This was my sanctuary. Over the last decade, I had developed a series of algorithms and predictive models for identifying distressed commercial assets before they even hit the public record. It was my secret sauce, the reason I was the top producer in the city. I noticed a login notification from 2 days ago. An IP address I didn't recognize, but the credentials used were a legacy set I had once shared with Caleb Norris when we were partners. We had split our firm 4 years ago. It had been an amicable separation, or so I thought. Caleb had wanted to focus on the social side of the business, the glad-handing and the whiskey-neat meetings, while I wanted the data. We had agreed that I would retain the rights to the predictive models, but he was allowed a 1-year sunset period to finish his existing projects. That period had ended 3 years ago, yet here was his digital footprint, ghosting through my private servers like a thief in the night. The logic check was simple. Caleb didn't have the technical mind to navigate my current encryption. Someone had given him a backdoor. I looked at the timestamp of his last access. It was an hour after I had dinner with Tessa 3 weeks ago, a dinner where I had foolishly left my tablet unlocked while I took a phone call. The connection was undeniable. My sister wasn't just a parasite. She was a conduit for my competitors. I spent the next 4 hours building a digital cage. I didn't block Caleb's access. That would be too loud. Instead, I diverted his credentials to a mirrored version of the server. I populated it with falsified data, projections that looked lucrative but were structurally unsound, assets that appeared ready for acquisition but were actually tangled in unsolvable zoning litigation. I watched him download a file titled Northwood Corridor Expansion, Final Strategy. It was a trap draped in the golden fleece of a sure thing. By 7 a.m., the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, a pale, anemic yellow. My phone began to vibrate on the desk. It was Audra. I didn't answer. She would have received the automated emails from the utility companies by now. 10 minutes later, a text from Tessa. Marshall, there's some glitch with the house accounts. Mom is frantic. Call her. I deleted the message. I wasn't interested in being the technician for their self-inflicted problems anymore. I showered, dressed in a crisp navy suit, and headed to the office. The city felt different today. The glass towers weren't just buildings. They were monuments to the same kind of cold calculation I was now embracing. At the office, the atmosphere was thick with the usual morning caffeine and forced optimism. My assistant, Marcus, met me at the door with a tablet. Mr. Vance, Caleb Norris called 3 times this morning. He seemed... Well, he was trying to sound casual, but he wanted to know if you were planning on attending the gala for the Children's Hospital tonight. Did he? I sat behind my desk, the leather creaking under my weight. Tell him I'll be there. And Marcus, I want a full audit of every referral we've sent to his firm in the last 24 months. I want to see how many of those deals he closed using my signatures. Of course, sir. Is everything okay? Everything is moving toward an equilibrium, Marcus. That's all. I spent the afternoon withdrawing myself as a guarantor from 3 of Tessa's business loans. These were small-scale retail ventures, a boutique that sold artisanal candles, a lifestyle space that never quite found its rhythm. I had signed for them because she had cried in my office, telling me I was her only hope. Now I saw the tears for what they were, a lubricant for the transfer of my wealth into her vanity projects. By removing myself as the guarantor, the banks would trigger an immediate review of her creditworthiness. Without my balance sheet behind her, she was a house of cards in a wind tunnel. I felt a strange sense of peace as I worked. It was the peace of a man who has finally stopped trying to carry a mountain and decided to let it crumble instead. I wasn't doing anything illegal. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply allowing the reality of their choices to manifest. If they wanted to view me as a resource, they had to accept the risk that the resource could be depleted. Around 4 p.m., I received a notification that the Northwood Corridor file had been accessed again. This time, the IP address traced back to a co-working space downtown where Evan Holt kept an office. The circle was tightening. Caleb, Tessa, and Evan, a trifecta of betrayal. They were passing my work around like a joint secret, laughing at the man who did the heavy lifting while they prepared to feast on the results. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the skyline. I thought about the King novels I used to read as a kid, stories about small towns where secrets were the real currency. There was always a moment where the protagonist realized that the people he loved were just masks for something much hungrier. I wasn't in a small town, and there was nothing supernatural about my predicament. It was just plain human greed. But the tension was the same. It was a pressure building behind a dam, a weight that only moved in one direction. I checked my watch. The gala started at 8:12 p.m. Caleb would be there, probably wearing a tuxedo I'd indirectly paid for through the deals he'd skimmed. He would shake my hand, clap me on the shoulder, and ask how the grind was going, all while holding a digital knife to my ribs. He didn't realize that I had already moved the knife. I reached into my drawer and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. It contained the real Northwood data, the actual projections, the actual zoning permits, and the actual financing leads. I wouldn't be sharing this with anyone. This was my exit strategy. The final task for the afternoon was the most personal. I called the estate attorney who handled my father's will. "Richard, this is Marshall Vance. I want to trigger the clause in the trust regarding the Northwood property. Yes, the one about the maintenance of the asset value. I have reason to believe the current residents are not meeting the fiduciary requirements. I want a full appraisal and a formal notice of intent to liquidate the trust's primary holding if the standards aren't met by the end of the quarter." Richard was silent for a moment. "Marshall, that's your mother's home. If you trigger that, she'll have to prove she has the liquid assets to maintain it or buy out the trust's share. You know she doesn't have that." "I know," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "But as the trustee, it is my responsibility to protect the asset for the beneficiaries. And since I am the sole remaining beneficiary after her life estate, I am simply protecting my future interests." "This is a very aggressive move, Marshall." "It's a very transparent one, Richard. Just do the paperwork." I hung up before he could respond. I felt a slight tremor in my fingers, not from fear, but from the sheer electricity of taking control. I had spent 42 years being the good son, the reliable brother, the steady partner. I had been the one who stayed behind to clean up the mess while everyone else went to the party. Tonight, I was going to the party, and I was bringing the bill with me. I left the office as the evening rush began. The streets were a river of brake lights and hurried pedestrians. I blended into the crowd, a silent predator in a city of prey. I wasn't a hero, and I knew that. I was becoming something colder, something harder. But as I watched the reflection of the streetlights in the window of my car, I didn't see a villain. I saw a man who had finally stopped paying for the privilege of being betrayed. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel was a cavern of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and the deceptive warmth of 300 people pretending to like each other. This was the annual Hospital Foundation Gala, an event where the city's power brokers traded favors over lukewarm hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the periphery, a glass of mineral water in my hand, watching the room with the detached interest of a biologist observing a petri dish. I had arrived precisely at 8:15 p.m., giving the social friction enough time to generate heat, but not enough to burn out. I spotted Caleb Norris across the room within minutes. He was leaning against a marble pillar, surrounded by a small clique of developers and city council members. He looked exactly the way he wanted to look, successful, relaxed, and indispensable. He was wearing a midnight blue velvet dinner jacket, a bold choice that screamed creative visionary, and he was holding court with a confidence that I knew was fueled by the proprietary data he had stolen from my server. Evan Holt was nearby, drifting between groups like a pollen-heavy bee. Evan's role in our ecosystem was vital. He was the narrator of other people's lives. He didn't build anything, he didn't finance anything, but he knew the precise moment a reputation was vulnerable enough to be tilted. I watched him lean in to whisper something to a prominent zoning commissioner, his eyes darting toward Caleb, then toward me. The rumor mill was already grinding. I didn't approach them. I waited for the orbit of the room to pull us together. It happened near the ice sculpture in the center of the hall, a giant, melting phoenix that felt uncomfortably on the nose. "Marshall, the man of the hour," Caleb boomed, extending a hand. His grip was firm, practiced. "I heard you were taking a bit of a sabbatical from the social circuit. Good to see you haven't turned into a total hermit." "I've been busy, Caleb," I said, my voice modulated to a pleasant, neutral frequency. "The Northwood project is demanding quite a bit of my attention." I saw the flicker in his eyes, a micro-expression of triumph. He thought I was still working on the original flawed data. Northwood, right? Big things happening there. Actually, I was just telling Commissioner Vance here that I've been looking into that corridor myself. It's a tricky bit of geography. Lots of hidden obstacles. Tricky is an understatement, I replied. But I've always found that if you have the right map, the obstacles aren't really obstacles at all. They're opportunities for the competition to trip. Evan Holt slid into the conversation, a predatory smile on his thin lips. Speaking of maps, Marshall, I heard a whisper that your family is looking to consolidate their holdings. Something about the Northwood estate going on the block? Tessa seemed a bit stressed when I saw her at the club this afternoon. The move was transparent. Evan was trying to bait me into an emotional response, something he could use to paint me as unstable or financially overextended. Families always have their internal discussions, Evan, I said, turning my gaze to him. Tessa tends to experience stress whenever she has to reconcile her lifestyle with her bank balance. It's a common ailment among the underemployed. Caleb laughed, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're a hard man, Marshall, but I suppose that's why you're so good with the spreadsheets. Me? I prefer the human element. For instance, I've just secured the preliminary backing for a major acquisition in the Northwood district. It's a strategy I've been developing for months. It's going to change the landscape of the whole north side. Is that so? I asked, tilting my head slightly. I'd love to hear more about it. Though knowing how you work, I imagine you've kept the details very secure. Ironclad, Caleb said, patting his breast pocket where I imagined his phone sat, loaded with the falsified files I had fed him. Maybe we can grab lunch next week. I might even let you in on a slice of the action for old time's sake. I look forward to it, I said. I moved away then, making my way toward the bar. I didn't need to do anything else to Caleb tonight. He had already publicly committed himself to a strategy built on a foundation of sand. The more he talked, the deeper he dug the hole. My task now was to ensure that when the ground gave way, everyone in this room saw him fall. I found a quiet corner near the terrace doors and pulled out my phone. I had 3 missed calls from Tessa and a string of increasingly frantic texts from Audra. Marshall, the bank called about the boutique loan. They're saying the guarantee has been withdrawn. This is an outrage. Call me immediately. I ignored them and opened a secure messaging app. I sent a single PDF to an investigative reporter I knew at the city's business journal, a man who lived for stories about corporate espionage and the fallout of creative accounting. The PDF contained evidence of Caleb's unauthorized access to my servers, tracked via the IP addresses I'd logged, paired with a list of the clients he had poached using my proprietary models. I didn't ask for a story. I simply provided the context for Caleb's recent success. I stepped out onto the terrace. The air was crisp, smelling of autumn and distant exhaust. Below me, the city was a grid of light, a massive machine that ran on the very things I was currently manipulating: information, reputation, and the fear of loss. I watched Evan Holt emerge onto the terrace a few minutes later, lighting a cigarette. He saw me and hesitated, then walked over, leaning against the stone balustrade. "You're playing a dangerous game, Marshall," Evan said, his voice low. "People are starting to talk. They're saying you're cutting your own mother off, that you're sabotaging Caleb because you can't keep up with his growth." "Let them talk, Evan. Talk is cheap. It's the one thing in this city that doesn't require a down payment." "It's not just talk. Tessa told me about the restroom incident. She's telling everyone you've had a breakdown, that you're becoming paranoid." I turned to look at him. I could see the reflection of the ballroom lights in his eyes. He was a small man who felt big by carrying other people's secrets. "And what do you think, Evan? You've known me a long time. Do I look like I'm having a breakdown?" Evan studied me. I kept my face a mask of professional calm. I didn't blink. I didn't fidget. I let the silence stretch until it became an interrogation. "You look like you're waiting for something," Evan said finally, his voice losing its edge of bravado. "I'm not waiting, Evan. I'm observing. There's a difference." "Well, for what it's worth, Caleb is moving fast. He's meeting with the Sterling Group tomorrow morning to sign the intent to buy on the Northwood parcels. If you have a move to make, you're running out of time." "Thank you for the update," I said. "I'll keep that in mind." Evan lingered for a moment, clearly wanting more, but I gave him nothing. He eventually flicked his cigarette into the dark and retreated back into the warmth of the gala. I waited until I was sure I was alone before I made my final move of the night. I called my office's security head. "The mirrored server. Is the download complete?" "Yes, Mr. Vance. Mr. Norris's office downloaded the entire Northwood final strategy packet about 20 minutes ago. They've already started integrating it into their presentation for the Sterling Group." "Excellent. Secure the logs. I want a digital trail that shows exactly when and where that data went. Understood, sir. I hung up and felt a surge of cold adrenaline. Caleb was about to walk into a boardroom and present a plan that relied on properties that weren't for sale, zoning that didn't exist, and a financing structure that would trigger an immediate fraud alert if anyone actually bothered to check the numbers. And because he had stolen it, he couldn't exactly complain when it turned out to be a fiction. I walked back into the ballroom. The music had shifted to something more upbeat, a jazz quartet playing a frantic, syncopated rhythm. I saw Caleb again, laughing, clinking glasses with the very people who would be distancing themselves from him by Monday morning. I saw Evan, leaning in to whisper a fresh piece of gossip into another ear. I felt like I was moving through a ghost story, a world where these people were already gone. They just hadn't realized it yet. They were ghosts of their own reputations, held up by nothing but the momentum of their past lies. As I headed for the exit, I passed Tessa. She was standing by the coat check, looking frantic. Her makeup was slightly smeared, and she was clutching her phone like a weapon. When she saw me, she lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "Marshall, what have you done? The bank. They're talking about seizing the inventory at the boutique. Mom is in tears. You have to fix this. You have to call them and tell them it was a mistake." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve. I didn't pull away. I just waited. "It wasn't a mistake, Tessa," I said quietly. "It was a correction." "A correction? You're ruining our lives. Over what? A dinner bill?" "If you think this is about a dinner bill, you've been paying even less attention than I thought." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the noise of the lobby. "I know about the server access, I know about Caleb, and I know about the ATM comments. You wanted to see what life was like without my technical, boring interference. Now you're seeing it." Her face went pale, a stark contrast to the vivid red of her lipstick. Her hand dropped from my arm as if I had suddenly become electrified. "You wouldn't," she breathed. "You're our brother." "I was your brother," I said, stepping past her. "Now I'm just the guy who owns the table you're sitting at, and I've decided I need the space for something else." I walked out of the hotel and into the night. The valet brought my car around, and this time I didn't even look at him. I drove toward the suburbs, toward the quiet, dark streets where the next phase of the collapse would begin. The construction was nearly complete. The fear was already starting to settle in. And the best part was, I hadn't had to break a single law to make it happen. I had simply stopped being the person they assumed I was. By the time I reached the outskirts of the city, the rain began to fall, a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof of the car. It sounded like the world was being washed clean. Or perhaps it was just the sound of the debris being swept away. The following Monday did not arrive with a bang. It arrived with the steady, rhythmic hum of a well-oiled machine coming to a halt. I spent the morning in my home office watching the fallout through a series of digital lenses. In the world of high finance, you don't need a sledgehammer to bring down a house. You just need to remove the 4 or 5 specific screws holding the load-bearing beams in place. By 10:02 a.m., the first of those screws had hit the floor. I received a notification from a contact at the city's building inspectorate. An anonymous tip, meticulously documented with photographs I had taken over the last 6 months, had triggered a surprise inspection of Tessa's lifestyle boutique. The building was a charming pre-war structure, but its electrical work was a labyrinth of non-compliance that I had quietly ignored while I was paying the rent. Now, with a formal complaint on the record, the city had no choice but to issue a temporary stop-work order until the wiring was brought up to code. It was a legal, bureaucratic strangulation. Tessa wouldn't be able to open her doors for weeks, and without my guarantee on her business line of credit, she had no capital to hire the necessary contractors. By noon, the second screw fell. I sat in my ergonomic chair, sipping a lukewarm espresso as I watched the Sterling Group's public relations feed. Caleb Norris was supposed to be in their boardroom at that very moment, presenting his grand vision for the Northwood corridor. I had already ensured that the Sterling Group's lead analyst received a confidential heads-up about the zoning inconsistencies in Caleb's proposal. I didn't have to lie. I simply pointed out that the parcels Caleb claimed to have under contract were actually tied up in a municipal conservation easement that I had helped establish 3 years ago. Caleb's proprietary data, the data he had stolen from my mirrored server, was a roadmap into a swamp of litigation and wasted deposits. The third screw was more personal. I had spent the weekend making calls to the various contractors I employed for my commercial developments. I didn't tell them to stop working for my mother or sister. I simply offered them lucrative, high-priority contracts on a new project in the city, with the caveat that they had to start immediately and remain on site for the next 60 days. It was a simple matter of resource allocation. When Audra's water heater failed at 2 p.m., an inevitable event, given I had canceled the preventative maintenance contract the week before, she found that every reputable plumber in a 50-mile radius was suddenly fully committed to a Vance commercial project. I watched the phone on my desk vibrate. It was Caleb. He called 4 times in 20 minutes. I let the calls roll to voicemail without listening to them. I could imagine the tone, the shift from bravado to confusion, and eventually to the frantic realization that he had been led into a desert with a map that pointed toward a mirage. At 3:30 p.m., I decided it was time for a more direct form of observation. I drove out to the Northwood estate. The neighborhood was an exercise in curated perfection, lawns that looked like velvet, silent streets, and an air of permanent Sunday afternoon. As I pulled my sedan onto the curb a few houses down from Audra's, I saw the signs of the slow-motion collapse. A yellow notice of non-compliance was taped to the front door of Tessa's boutique 3 blocks away. A delivery truck was parked in front of Audra's driveway, the driver looking confused as he tried to figure out why the gate code, which I had changed that morning via the cloud security app, was no longer working. I stayed in the car, my windows tinted, observing. Audra emerged from the front door, wrapped in a pashmina that looked too heavy for the mild weather. She was gesturing wildly at the delivery driver. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the tension in her shoulders. This was a woman who had never had to navigate a logistical hurdle in her life. I had been the invisible hand that smoothed the path, the one who negotiated the contracts, paid the invoices, and managed the staff. Without that hand, her world was becoming a series of unsolvable puzzles. Tessa pulled into the driveway a few minutes later, her car screeching to a halt behind the delivery truck. She hopped out, her hair disheveled, shouting something at the driver. The 2 women stood in the driveway, surrounded by the symbols of their status, yet unable to even enter their own garage. It was a tableau of impotence. I felt a cold, analytical satisfaction. This wasn't about being mean, it was about the restoration of gravity. They had lived for years in a state of artificial buoyancy, floating on the current of my labor while treating the source of that labor with contempt. Now the current had stopped. I put the car in gear and drove slowly past them. I didn't honk, I didn't wave, I just looked. For a brief second, Audra's eyes met mine through the glass. I saw the moment of recognition, followed by a flash of genuine terror. Not the terror of physical harm, but the terror of a person realizing that the person they thought they controlled was actually the one who controlled the oxygen in the room. I kept driving. I spent the evening at a small, quiet bar near the docks, far from the country club and the gala circuits. I brought a folder of documents, the final pieces of the reputational puzzle. I had compiled a record of every favor I had done for Evan Holt over the years, the debts I'd settled, the introductions I'd made, and the quiet ways I'd protected him from his own poor judgment. I wasn't going to release them to the public. That would be messy. Instead, I sent a digital copy to Evan with a very short note. I've noticed you've been sharing a lot of stories lately. I thought you might like some more accurate material for your next conversation. Please be careful with it. It's the only copy that isn't currently sitting in a pre-scheduled email to the board of your firm. The silence from Evan's end was immediate and absolute. Within an hour, his social media accounts, usually a fountain of subtle jabs and local gossip, went dark. The narrator had been silenced by the weight of his own history. As the sun set, I took a walk along the pier. The water was dark and choppy, hitting the pilings with a dull, repetitive thud. I thought about the concept of isolated roads that I had read about in those old novels. The idea that you can be surrounded by people and yet be completely alone because of the path you've chosen. I felt that isolation now, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like armor. I was no longer the man who arrived late to dinner with an apology on his lips. I was the man who had turned the dinner into a reckoning. The twist, the one I hadn't fully articulated until this moment, was that Audra hadn't just been a passive beneficiary of Tessa's betrayal. As I reviewed the internal communication logs I'd pulled from the family's shared cloud storage, access I'd maintained despite their attempts to lock me out, I found the emails. Audra had been the one to suggest to Tessa that she should leverage my data with Caleb. She had described it as a way to rebalance the family's influence, making sure I didn't get too big for my britches. She had deliberately positioned my sister as the intermediary, knowing that if it all went wrong, she could claim ignorance and let Tessa take the fall. It was a masterclass in manipulation. My mother hadn't just used me for my money, she had actively conspired to sabotage my professional standing to ensure I remained a dependent part of her social structure. She wanted a provider, but she didn't want a peer. I sat on a wooden bench, watching the lights of the city flicker across the bay. The realization should have hurt, but it only served to sharpen my resolve. The final confrontation wouldn't be a private affair. It couldn't be. For a woman like Audra, a private loss was just a temporary setback. She needed a public realignment. She needed to see the narrative she had carefully constructed about the loyal, successful Vance family dissolve in the light of day. I checked my calendar. 2 days from now, the Northwood Neighborhood Association was holding its annual Founders' Day luncheon. It was the social event of the year for Audra's circle, a high-visibility gathering where reputation was the only currency that mattered. I had been invited as a guest of honor in previous years, the shining example of local success. I pulled up the guest list on my phone. Caleb was there. Evan was there. Every person who had whispered about my breakdown or benefited from my silence would be in that room. I began drafting the invitation for the private meeting I would hold immediately following the luncheon. I would invite the key stakeholders from the Sterling Group, the estate attorneys, and the bank's vice president. I would present the truth, not as a grievance, but as a business restructuring. The logic was sound, the evidence was documented, the trap was set. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange sense of lightness. I had spent so long trying to be the person they wanted me to be, a person who was ultimately a ghost in his own life. Now I was solid. I was visible, and I was in total control. The coldness I had felt earlier had settled into a steady, reliable temperature. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just finished. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. No one was following me. No one was lurking in the shadows. The only thing they had to fear was the truth, and I was the only one who held the key to that particular room. I drove home, the road ahead clear and empty, the city's skyline glowing like a furnace in the rearview mirror. The construction was done. Now, the demolition could begin. The Founders' Day luncheon was held under a massive white pavilion on the Northwood Commons, a stretch of grass so perfectly green it looked synthetic. This was the pinnacle of Audra's social calendar, the day when the old guard of the suburbs gathered to congratulate themselves on the preservation of their exclusivity. I arrived precisely as the first course. A chilled gazpacho was being served. I didn't take a seat at the family table. Instead, I moved through the crowd with a predator's economy of motion, nodding to local magistrates and developers who had spent the last week hearing quiet, unsettling rumors about the Vance stability. I saw Audra first. She was sitting at the center table, flanked by the Neighborhood Association president and a woman whose husband sat on the board of the regional bank. Audra was performing her usual role, the poised matriarch, a picture of grace under pressure. But as I drew closer, I saw the fine tremors in her hands as she lifted her spoon. She had spent the morning dealing with a home that was slowly ceasing to function and a daughter who was likely hiding in a bedroom to avoid the creditors now circling her boutique. When our eyes met, she didn't smile. Her face went taut, a porcelain mask stretched to the point of cracking. Tessa was missing. I knew why. She was currently at her shop, meeting with a city inspector I had specifically requested to follow up on the electrical citations. She was learning that some problems cannot be charmed away with a smile or a reference to one's lineage. I walked toward the head table. The conversation around it dipped, then vanished. I didn't wait for an invitation. I stood behind a vacant chair, my hands resting on the back of the mahogany wood. "Marshall," the association president said, his voice hesitant, "we weren't sure you'd make it today, given the news about the firm." "The news is often just a lack of context, Bill," I said, my voice carrying just far enough to reach the neighboring tables. "I'm here to provide the context. In fact, I've organized a small briefing in the library of the clubhouse immediately following the coffee service. I think several of you will find the agenda very relevant to your own interests." I looked directly at Audra. "Mother, you'll want to be there. We're discussing the future of the Northwood estate. And Caleb, I see you over there. You should join us. I believe the Sterling Group's lead analyst is already on his way. He has some questions about the feasibility study you submitted on Friday." Caleb, seated 3 tables away, dropped his cloth napkin. The bravado he had displayed at the gala had evaporated, replaced by the sallow, hollowed-out look of a man who realized he had been walking a tightrope that was actually a tripwire. He tried to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. I didn't stay to chat. I turned and walked toward the clubhouse, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the grass. Behind me, the murmur of the crowd rose like the sound of a disturbed hive. I had spent years being the quiet background noise of their lives. Now, I was the only frequency they could hear. The clubhouse library was a room of dark wood, leather-bound books that no one ever read, and the heavy scent of old tobacco. I stood at the head of a long conference table, arranging 3 folders with surgical precision. The first person to enter was Caleb, looking frantic. He was followed by Evan Holt, who looked as though he wanted to be anywhere else on the planet, and finally, Audra. She entered last, her head held high, though her eyes were darting around the room as if searching for an exit. Behind them came the professionals. Richard, the estate attorney, the bank vice president, and a representative from the Sterling Group named Marcus Thorne. I had invited them all under the guise of an emergency asset review. What is this, Marshal? Audra asked, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. This is a public event. You are making a spectacle. I'm making a record, Mother, I said calmly. Sit down. The sheer authority in my voice surprised even me. It was the tone I used when a multi-million-dollar closing was about to fall apart due to someone else's incompetence. It was the tone of the only person in the room who actually knew the truth. They sat. The silence in the room was heavy, pressurized. Let's start with the Northwood Corridor, I said, sliding a document across the table toward Marcus Thorne. Mr. Thorne, you were under the impression that Caleb Norris had secured the development rights for the parcels bordering the conservation easement. Caleb, you told the Sterling Group that you had proprietary predictive models showing a 90% probability of a zoning variance. Caleb shifted in his seat. I had reason to believe the data was sound, Marshal. It came from a trusted source. The source was my server, I said, which you accessed without authorization. The problem is, Caleb, I've known you were in my system for months. The data you stole was a fabrication, a dummy set I created to identify exactly who was leaking my work. The parcels you've spent your firm's capital on are legally protected from development for the next 99 years. There is no variance. There is no project. There is only a massive, uninsured loss for your firm. Marcus Thorne picked up the folder, his eyes scanning the zoning maps. He looked at Caleb with a coldness that made the velvet-jacketed man look small. Is this true, Norris? Caleb didn't answer. He looked at the floor, his face the color of wet cement. Next, I said, turning to Audra. The Northwood estate. Richard, you've reviewed the trust documents I sent over? The attorney nodded slowly. I have, Marshal. Given the withdrawal of the maintenance funds and the failure to meet the fiduciary requirements for asset preservation, the trust has the right to initiate a forced sale of the property to protect the principal for the sole remaining beneficiary, which is you. Audra let out a sharp, jagged breath. You would sell my home? Your father's house? Where is your loyalty? Loyalty is a reciprocal arrangement, Mother, I said. I pulled a tablet from my briefcase and turned it around so everyone could see the screen. It displayed a series of emails, the ones where she had coached Tessa on how to sell my data to Caleb. I found these in the shared cloud backup. You didn't just want my money. You wanted to ensure I was too professionally compromised to ever stop giving it to you. You sabotaged my business so you could keep your ATM. The room went still. Evan Holt looked at the ceiling, trying to pretend he wasn't witnessing a family's public disintegration. The bank vice president cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. I've already filed the notice of intent with the court, I continued, my voice steady. The house will be appraised on Monday. Since the utility accounts have already defaulted and the maintenance contracts have been terminated, the property is currently classified as a distressed asset. I will be purchasing the trust's interest myself at a significant discount. You will have 30 days to vacate, Mother. I've already contacted a high-end assisted living facility in the city. It's much smaller, but the management is excellent. And since I'll be paying the fees, I've ensured you'll have a lovely view of the brick wall across the alley. Audra's face crumpled. The mask finally broke. You're a monster, she whispered. No, I said. I'm a broker. I'm just settling the accounts. You and Tessa decided that I was a resource to be managed. This is what it looks like when the resource manages itself. I turned to Evan Holt. Evan, you've been very active in the rumors about my mental state. I've shared a folder with your firm's ethics committee regarding the consulting fees you've been taking from developers to feed them information about my clients. I believe they'll be calling you for a meeting tomorrow morning. I wouldn't expect a severance package. Evan looked like he might be physically ill. He didn't even try to defend himself. He just stood up and walked out of the room, his shoulders slumped. This meeting is over, I said, standing up. Richard, please finalize the paperwork for the house purchase. Mr. Thorne, I suggest you have your legal team contact Caleb's firm before he tries to move what's left of his assets. As for you, Caleb, don't ever call me again. I walked out of the library before any of them could respond. I didn't want to hear their excuses or their pleas. I didn't want the satisfaction of their apologies, because I knew they wouldn't be sincere. They would just be the sounds of people trying to negotiate a better deal. I walked through the clubhouse lobby, past the framed photos of the men who had built this world. I felt a strange, cold peace. The architecture of my life had been a lie, a beautiful facade built on a foundation of betrayal. I had spent today tearing it down. It was a violent act in its own way, but it was a quiet, legal, and utterly precise one. As I stepped back out onto the commons, the sun was still shining. The luncheon was breaking up, and people were wandering toward their luxury SUVs. I saw Tessa pulling into the parking lot in her car, which was making a rhythmic, grinding noise. She saw me and stopped, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. She had clearly just come from the boutique, where the closed by order of the city sign was now drying in the sun. She started to open her door, her mouth moving as if to shout, but I simply held up a hand, a single palm-forward gesture that told her everything she needed to know. The support was gone, the bank was finished with her, and I was no longer her brother, I was the man who owned her debt. She stayed in the car. I walked to my sedan, the silver paint gleaming in the afternoon light. I didn't feel like a villain, despite what Audra had said. I felt like a man who had finally found the right map. I drove away from the clubhouse, away from the suburb that had tried to consume me, and toward the city. The final confrontation was over. The map was clear. All that remained was the final action, the one that would ensure the safety nets were not just unhooked, but removed entirely. I checked my mirror one last time. Behind me, the white pavilion of the Founders' Day luncheon looked like a sinking ship on a sea of green. I didn't look back again. The air in my city office was thin and tasted of ozone, a byproduct of the high-end air filtration system that ran 24 hours a day. It was Tuesday morning, 48 hours after the Founders' Day luncheon, and the silence in the room was absolute. I sat at my desk, watching the final digital dominoes align on my screen. The atmosphere reminded me of the stillness before a massive weather front moves in, the kind of atmospheric tension where the birds stop singing and the pressure drops until your ears pop. It was a controlled, clinical environment, the perfect place to finish a restructure. My first act of the morning was the formal execution of the property transfer. Richard had messaged me at 8 a.m. The paperwork was ready for my digital signature. I scrolled through the 100-page document that detailed the liquidation of the Vance Family Trust's primary holding. It was a dry, technical piece of writing filled with terms like failure to cure, non-compliance, and transfer of title. I reached the final page and clicked the box. With a single pulse of light from the fiber optic cable, the house in Northwood, the site of my childhood, the stage for Audra's theater of status, was no longer her domain. It was an asset on my balance sheet. I didn't stop there. I opened the portal for the boutique's commercial lease. I had been the silent guarantor for Tessa's space for 3 years. Since the city's building inspector had found the wiring to be a hazard and the business had failed to provide a remediation plan, the landlord was within his rights to terminate the lease immediately to protect his property. I had already spoken to him. He was a man who valued prompt payments and minimal drama, 2 things I had provided and Tessa had not. I authorized the final payment of the arrears on the condition that the locks be changed by noon today. Tessa's inventory, the thousands of dollars of curated candles, silk scarves, and imported stationery, would be moved to a storage locker in an industrial park 50 miles away. I had paid for the first month's rent on that locker. After that, the contents would be auctioned. I leaned back, my chair creaking softly. The internal monologue that usually raced with variables and risk assessments was quiet. I felt a sense of profound observation, as if I were watching a complex chemical reaction reach its inevitable conclusion. There was no heat in it. There was no rage. There was only the fulfillment of a logical sequence. Around 11 a.m., my personal phone began to vibrate. I placed it on the desk and watched it dance across the polished wood. It was Tessa. Then it was Audra. Then it was a number I recognized as Caleb's office. I didn't answer any of them. I didn't need to hear the sound of their voices. I knew the script they would be following, the initial shock, the transition into indignation, and the final frantic shift into pleading. They were people who believed that words could rewrite reality. I was a man who knew that only signatures and ledgers mattered. I decided to conclude the matter where it had begun. I drove out to the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was a Tuesday, so the club was quiet, the parking lot filled with the luxury cars of retirees and the underemployed. I walked into the lobby, the same scent of citrus and floor wax greeting me. I didn't go to the dining room. I went to the administrative offices. The manager, Arthur, looked up from his desk as I entered. He looked older than he had on that anniversary night. He had likely spent the last few days fielding calls about the Vance family's sudden decline in standing. "Mr. Vance," he said, standing up, "I was just about to call you. Regarding the secondary sponsorship." "I'm not here to discuss the sponsorship, Arthur," I said, placing a thick envelope on his desk. "I'm here to settle the final accounts. Inside this envelope, you will find a check for the outstanding balances for Audra Vance and Tessa Quinn. It includes the dinner from last week, the bar tabs from the previous month, and a generous gratuity for the staff who had to endure their company." Arthur opened the envelope, his eyes widening at the amount. "This is very thorough, Marshall." "It is, and as of this moment, I am withdrawing my personal recommendation for their membership. Since they no longer have a primary sponsor or the independent liquid assets to meet the club's minimum requirements, I expect their names will be removed from the rolls by the end of the business day." Arthur looked uncomfortable. They've been members for a long time, Marshall. Your father. My father is gone, Arthur, and the man who was paying for their presence here has decided to stop. I trust the board will find this in line with the club's bylaws regarding financial solvency. Of course, he murmured. I'll see to it. I left the office and walked toward the west dining room. It was empty at this hour, the tables set with white linen and silver that caught the midday sun. I walked to the corner table where we had sat for the anniversary. I stood there for a moment, looking at the chair where Audra had sat, the place where she had told me to pay because that was the arrangement. I pulled a single small envelope from my pocket and propped it up against the centerpiece of the table. Inside was a copy of the eviction notice for the house and the address of the industrial storage locker where Tessa's life work was being hauled. On the front of the envelope, I had written only 2 words, account closed. I walked out of the club and into the bright, unforgiving light of the afternoon. My car was waiting at the curb. As I reached for the door handle, I saw a familiar vehicle turn into the driveway. It was Audra's SUV, driven by Tessa. They had likely come to the club as a last resort, a place where they still felt they had power, a place where they could find someone to sympathize with their plight. They saw me. The SUV slowed, then stopped. Tessa rolled down the window, her face a mask of desperation. Audra was in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her jaw set in a line of frozen pride. "Marshall!" Tessa shouted, her voice cracking. "The locks. They changed the locks at the shop. And there are men at the house with clipboards. What are you doing? Where are we supposed to go?" I stood by my car, the engine already idling quietly. I looked at them, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my family. I didn't see people I owed. I saw 2 individuals who had spent decades treating a human being as an infrastructure project. "You should check the west dining room," I said, my voice clear and carrying across the quiet driveway. "I've left the final instructions on the table." "Marshall, please," Tessa started, but the sound of her own name seemed to fail her. She looked at Audra, but my mother remained motionless, a statue of a life that no longer existed. I didn't wait for a response. I got into my car and closed the door. The interior was silent, the leather smelling of nothing but newness and precision. I put the car in gear and began to move. Tessa stayed in the middle of the drive, the SUV idling as she watched me approach. I didn't slow down, I didn't swerve. I drove toward the exit with the steady, unwavering speed of a man who knew exactly where he was going. At the last possible second, she turned the wheel and pulled onto the grass, letting me pass. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't check to see if they were crying or shouting. I didn't wonder where they would sleep tonight or how they would explain their sudden absence from the social register. Those were variables in someone else's equation now. I reached the main road and turned toward the city. The skyline was a jagged graph of glass and steel, a landscape built on the very principles I had finally mastered. I felt a slight, sharp pressure in my chest, not of regret, but of a final, clean snap. The connection was gone. The extraction was complete. I reached over and switched on the radio, finding a station that played nothing but the news, the steady stream of market reports and weather updates filling the cabin. It was a cold, objective sound, and I found it entirely sufficient. I drove into the heart of the city, my hand steady on the wheel, a man who had finally stopped paying for the privilege of his own betrayal. I parked the car in my reserved spot, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the button for the top floor. The doors slid shut with a soft, final click.